Greetings. Welcome to Dr. English's Book Lovers Book Club. I'm Dr. English and I teach English. This week I'm carrying on my dystopian novel trend of late, and I have just finished reading Animal Farm. This is one that has Animal Farm and 1984 together. I got it from my local library. I thought I had a copy of Animal Farm, and I looked all over my bookshelves and I could not find it. And I thought too that I had read Animal Farm back in high school and or back in college, and I read through Animal Farm and I realized I don't think I actually have ever read Animal Farm. I've read 1984 several times, but I had not read Animal Farm. I would have remembered all of these characters if I had read that. So this was actually my first time reading Animal Farm, which kind of shocked me. And there's a great introduction in this book to this edition, and I really liked how the reviewer helped remind me of the fact that Animal Farm was really, it's about Stalin and Stalin's regime. And so I thought, wow, I could, it's just, once you stop and think, I mean, most people who've read it understand that, but it just needed to be reminded. And so I was making all these parallels as I was reading it. I thought this one read really quickly, and it's really a quick book, where I feel like 1984 was very just, I think it was the last, thing that George Orwell wrote, and he was under pressure to finish it because he was dying. And Animal Farm is a little bit more like, it's just, there's a lot more life to it, and it just seems like it's a really nice story about our farm animals. And I know that's not, because I kept thinking about Stalin and Trotsky and all the people that Snowball, the people that Snowball and Napoleon represent. But I was just trying to think about other people that might have been represented in this with different, and particularly, I mean, it was just like the story, about Boxer is just so incredibly powerful. And thinking about, to me, how Boxer was almost like he represented, the people, the strength of the people. And but it also just reminded me, I thought about, like, even in our current society, about how easily it is to lie and manipulate the past. So much of what happened in Animal Farm, Napoleon, how devious he was, and how, he, he betrayed people, and he betrayed all of the people, and to believe that they had it better, and to kind of like how, they just forgot things. And yet there were, Benjamin was the one who was like, didn't say much, but like he had a good memory and he knew. And so I think that's true. That was obviously true under Stalin, that there were people, who did remember. But what the danger is, of a totalitarian state, to think about, like, how easily someone can manipulate the history of what actually happened, and who can remember what happens, because um, if you continue to change that narrative, people will think, well, that's not true, that didn't happen. So what is truth is, the question I kept asking throughout that is how easily people in totalitarian regimes can manipulate the truth. And then, and as like all people in power, they keep telling people how much they have, and yet they're living high off the hog. No pun intended, or maybe it was intended. But I think that's probably the kind of inside joke that George Orwell had, was, people are living high off the hog that are in power. And just the, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking about, they get this whiskey, and then they, put away, land to just grow, barley so they can have beer. And it's just like, and that's the way it is. It's the truth, is that people who are in power do have get the best of the best. And they're not going to relinquish that power easily. And I see those dynamics in power, out, folding, right now, unfolding right now as I speak. And so I think it's really important that people do read, Animal Farm, because it does such a succinct job of showing that change over time, how quickly it can happen. And so, I would, strongly suggest, if you haven't read Animal Farm, that you should. And then if you don't know a whole lot about Stalinism and what happened in Russia, which was then, of course, turned, and became the Soviet Union, you might want to brush up on the history of that, while you can. I always think how quickly that might be lost, because people, haven't got the recorded history And so, at the age of the internet, it would be very easy to manipulate, the past. Um, so I would say, I'm thinking about like when I thought about Snowball as Trotsky and about, he was really brilliant and had all these wonderful ideas. And I think he really believed in the principles of communism. It doesn't work, but yet, if you really look at it closely, you realize that it's for the collective good of all. But it just seems like whenever human beings are involved, they're going to manipulate and the system, that could really work well. But there's never, to me, it's like there's never going to be human beings who aren't going to take advantage of that kind of, any kind of, a society that we live in. And so, and I think that that's, interesting for us, or not interesting, but it's important for us to be aware of that, that the truth of that. And so I really like the way this was written. It's very different from my perspective than 1984, which is, it's almost, that's a book within a book. And but not, I mean, there's a small book in a book, but it's the story of, Big Brother and the people who, want it. And that's also like a comparison to Stalin and Trotsky too, but it's just much more complicated. This is just very swiftly tells you how, the story of how this can happen. And I love that he used the animals on a farm, as an example. And maybe a few stereotypes there, but um, there's so many, characters in this that he brings it to life as like a separate, kind of character in the book. And so I'm going to read a passage that a lot of people, maybe I shouldn't read this, but it might give a few things away, but it's such a powerful passage almost at the very end of the little novella, and it's about Boxer. Fools, fools! Shouted Benjamin, prancing around them and stamping the earth with his small hooves. Fools! Do you not see what is written on the side of that van? That gave the animals pause, and there was a hush. Muriel began to spell out the words, but Benjamin pushed her aside, and in the midst of a deadly silence, he read, Alfred Simmons, horse slaughterer and glue boiler, Willingdon, dealer in hides and bone meal, kennels supplied. Do you not understand what that means? They are taking Boxer to the knackers. A cry of horror burst from all the animals. At this moment, the man on the box whipped up his horses, and the van moved out of the yard at a small trot. All the animals followed, crying out at the top of their voices. Clover forced her way to the front. The van began to gather speed. Clover tried to stir her stout limbs to a gallop and achieved a canter. Boxer, she cried. Boxer, Boxer, Boxer! And just at this moment, as though he had heard the uproar outside, Boxer's face, with the white stripe down his nose, appeared at the small window at the back of the van. Boxer, cried Clover in a terrible voice. Boxer, get out! Get out quickly! They're taking you to your death! And so, of course, Boxer is the very big horse who's constantly saying, I will work harder, I will work harder. Really committed to making things better for Animal Farm. And then later it's Manor Farm, back to Manor Farm. And it reminds me a little bit, Animal Farm, of the first Hunger Games, if you recall. I reviewed that about who Katniss Everdeen, who's her aim at the end of that. And I see that it's like what goes around comes around. It's probably not at the end of the Hunger Games. It's later, uh, but um, but that understanding of like powers just switch sometimes with the same outcome, and I think that's we we don't seem to remember that. We all act like the animals on Animal Farm. I swear to God. So I just like, will we ever learn? I'm not sure we ever will, because we're human beings, and it's easy for people, human beings, to be manipulated, and it's easy to have a mob rule. People are frightened, or people, are easily deceived by people, sadly, and so that's the part that's really hard to swallow. And here we know it. We have this literature to remind us, and yet we still fall prey to that kind of thing. Um, so should we read this? Yeah, I definitely think this should be taught. I think younger teachers probably don't have the context. I was born, not born until 1960, but I was, living during the time of nuclear, annihilation. That was the fear. I was 3 when the new Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And so I lived in that shadow and grew up in a small place close to a telecommunications tower that would have been a first target. And now I'm like watching some, post-apocalyptic shows. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to like keep that in mind, as I did growing up. Like we used to have, you know, bombing drills when I was a kid. So, um, but I feel like my whole generation grew up with that kind of anxiety, and it's that's probably not a good thing either. It was a good feeling in the late night 1980s to not in the not 1990 to not have that hanging over your head all the time. So it's kind of a good feeling, and in the move towards nuclear disarmament. So, and I'm glad I'm talking about that because the next book I'll probably do is called On the Beach. That's an old book, but it's a post-apocalyptic book, not a dystopian book. So thank you for joining me. Like I said, this is a book I definitely think you should teach in high school if you have an opportunity. It should continue to be taught. So, but thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.